The history of classical Athens is of course well known. We have for a start the histories provided by Herodotus and Thucydides. We have an abundance of historical references in Plato and Aristotle, as well as the playwrights and poetry, all of it matched by a very solid knowledge of archaeology. There are some dark areas and many historical problems remain, although none of them are considered serious. Generally speaking, this is a known history that is not in itself problematic. And yet, I think there is an undercurrent in Athenian history and intellectual life that is not explicit in our accepted accounts, although there are enough clues to make it plain. The problem emerges especially in Plato, and takes an explicit form there, although it is an unspoken agenda underpinning the Platonic dialogues throughout in a more comprehensive way. Indeed, I doubt it's possible to have a proper estimation of the Platonic enterprise, and the Socratic too, unless we appreciate this undercurrent. By an undercurrent, I mean a hidden history, one that is never quite spoken. It leaves traces in our sources, but otherwise it acts more like a shadow. I only propose giving a brief sketch of it here. The problem concerns the reception of Homer. More importantly, it concerns the textualization of Homer, the movement of the Homeric poems from oral to written forms. It is widely believed, at least, that the Homeric poems were originally oral compositions, although this is not certain. There are, and there have long been, scholars who question this, and who believe rather that the Homeric poems only have the appearance of having been oral compositions, when in fact they are the work of a literate milieu composed in writing. This is a more vexed issue than we might imagine, impacts directly on the wider question of the transition of the archaic into the classical, the pre-literate into the literate, not to mention by extension the transition of the mythical into the philosophical. In any case, we're told that this happened in Athens. The Athenians acquired or appropriated Homer, and it was in Athens that Homer was first written down. This is very important. This is the so-called Pisistraton recension, which formed, they say, under Pisistratus and the rule of the Pisistratids in the 6th century BC. The Pisistratian reforms of Athens were structural. For a start, Pisistratus united Attica, revised the calendar, and elevated Athens to Pan-Hellenic prominence. The acquisition of Homer was a key element in this revolution. Its importance is underlined in the fact that it was Pisistratus who introduced the greater celebration of the Athenaea, the festival of the goddess of the polis, into the Pan-Athenaea, which festival was specifically designed as a festival for the recitation of Homer. That is to say, Pisistratus had poems of Homer committed to writing, which is to say he fixed the text, and at the same time, as part of the same project, he embodied these texts in a new festival. It was Pan-Hellenic, open to all Greeks. It made Athens the cultural centre of the Greek world, not least because Athens now defined and, in a sense, owned the poems of Homer, who was now also placed firmly at the centre of Pan-Hellenic culture. How exactly this came about is somewhat mysterious. The process left some textual fingerprints. The Athenians, for instance, have clearly added themselves and their favourites into the catalogue of ships in the Iliad to enhance Athens and Athenians in the Homeric texts. We are entirely unsure what other changes came into Homer at this point, or how oral materials might have been collated, sorted, sifted and changed in the transition to writing. In any case, the poems of Homer in writing are an Athenian production. Dozens of places in Greece claimed Homer as their own, but Athens took hold of the Homeric texts. They were defined by the Pisistratian recension. The secret history of Athens concerns the acquisition of Homer, the production of the Homeric canon, and the aftermath of this, extending down to Plato's time. In part, this secret history is signalled by the confusion and silences in our sources regarding the rule of the Pisistratids, but it is certainly not solely or even primarily a political matter. It goes much deeper than that. Nonetheless, it is important to note that Pisistratus was a populist who championed the lower class, challenged the city's aristocracy and confiscated their property, along with comprehensive religious reforms. The appropriation of Homer was a centerpiece of this, which ought to be seen as a single project of reform. Moving into the 5th century, there were deeply conflicted views of the Pisistrative tyranny. Democratic opinion fell against it almost as a matter of shame, even though the very shape of the city and its institutions and its place among Greeks was an accomplishment attributable to Pisistratus and those who ruled succeeding him up to the removal of Hippias by the Spartans. My surmise in overview is that the introduction of Homer into Athens created some profound problems. I suspect in any case that a lot more of Homer was of Athenian origin, coming into the text only as it came into writing, than is generally admitted, if indeed we cannot speak of Homer as a composition of that time. The text was shaped by Pisistratus far more than conventional accounts allow. This in itself is the sort of official secret that often gathers around the point at which a hallowed text becomes canonical. When the Athenians appropriated the epics of Homer, they were not going to admit also crafting them and reshaping them, but insist the canon is pristine and exactly the same as of old from the rhapsode's own lips. The official edition comes with its own justification and backstory. The power of the written text is that over time it supersedes all other versions. Strictly speaking, we should refer to the Athenian Homer. But the introduction of Homer, establishing Homer as canonical, also had theological implications. At this point, Homer becomes officially, if he had not been so before, the great authority on the nature of the gods. This, I suggest, produced an acute problem in Athens in particular. It is a problem that Plato signals in various contexts, and indeed might be seen as a problem standing in the background of a wide range of Platonic dialogues, as well as works by playwrights and others. The problem, in short, is this. The state cultus of the Athenian polis, the cultus of the Acropolis, and therefore the cultus of the citizenry, but especially those noble-born, has certain deities at its centre. Chief among them, of course, is Athena herself, but second among them is Poseidon. There is Hephaestus and Gaia as well, chief deities of the Acropolis, those four, but the great gods, the Olympians, are Athena and Poseidon. They are the principal guardians of the city. In the Homeric epics, however, and especially the Odyssey, these two deities are presented as rivals. This, I think, was deeply and profoundly at odds with the cultus and, more importantly, the theology of Athens prior to Pisistratus. That is to say, Pisistratus introduced a theological error into the city. Subsequently, I think stories, myths, mythoi developed that covered over this. We hear the story of how Athena and Poseidon vied for the city in a contest. Poseidon offered the horse and Athena the olive tree. These, I think, are post-Homeric configurations. It was Homer, Pisistratus's Homer, who introduced the idea that Athena and Poseidon are rivals, but it was alien to and contrary to the religion of the Acropolis. It did damage to Athena's most ancient institutions. The secret history of Athens consists in the long aftermath of this confrontation, the playing out of all its implications. It had compromised the spiritual integrity of the polis. This is really what is going on in Athens throughout the classical period. It is largely unspoken because it concerns sacred and secret things. It is notable how the Acropolis looms in the background of our classical Athens. Classical texts like the plays or the dialogues of Plato take us into the city, the market, the gymnasium, the theatre, the law courts. But rarely do we look up at the Acropolis and ask, what is happening up there? There was, of course, a priesthood, an establishment, a treasury with wealth, venerated authorities, sacred traditions, bloodlines and lineages. This is always in the background, rarely in the foreground. And yet the Acropolis, or the Kekropia, as the more accurate name if we are referring not to the place but to the religious establishment that resided there, the Kekropia shaped the entire life of the city through ritual and festivals, the regulation of marriages and other devices that permeated life. This needs to be contrasted to the stateless theology of Homer. Homer's depiction of the Greek gods does not belong to any particular local cultus. It is unattached to cultic life. Conventional accounts describe a period of religious decay. The hold of the gods, we are told, was wearing thin. Then it said there was a philosophical revolution in Greece among the pre-Socratics, in which the gods were pushed aside for scientific cosmologies. In Athens, we are told, there was a backlash against this by the religious conservatives. The modern view of this is shaped anachronistically by Enlightenment, religion versus science polarities. But there is no denying that there was a clash of ideas and that the religious establishment was in phases vigorous in keeping errant philosophies and influences out of the city. On this reading, Socrates himself falls in this conflict. He was charged with the distinctly religious crime of introducing new gods. The problem is not new gods, though, nor the atoms of Democritus. The central problem is that the introduction of Homer, the Athenian Homer, violates the central structures of the city's religion. It is no small matter. It introduces, by extension, metaphysical error. The whole history of classical Athens, every bit of it, should be seen in this light. Throughout the classical period, we should understand that the Athenians are struggling to resolve this problem. It is really as fundamental as the problem of the one and the many, for this is what Athena and Poseidon represent. Assuredly, as Olympians, as mythic figures, they represent much more than that. But for our purposes, it is enough to see that this is what they represent. Athena represents the realm of pure ideas. Thus, she is virgin and philosophical and contemplative and wise. Poseidon is the god of the shifting seas, the horse-like breaking waves, the realm of flux. They are, in other words, the one and the many, being, becoming. They express in myth those basic polarities that we know from Greek philosophy. The cultus of the Acropolis, in the mythic mode, was precisely a religious enactment of this polarity, the one and the many, being, becoming, not expressed philosophically but mythically. The philosophers asked, what is the relation between the one and the many? But the question was deep in the archaic mind as well, and the answers it supplied took the form of myth and ritual and incantation and tradition and festival. I am supposing that the rites of the Acropolis, as they concerned Athena and Poseidon, implied, enacted, a certain metaphysics. I don't believe that Athenian religion was unintelligent or shallow, or that the philosophical riches of the city were unrelated to it or in spite of it. The relationship between Athena and Poseidon is, amongst other things, the relationship between what the philosophers were to call the one and the many. In any case, Athena and Poseidon shared the citadel on the Acropolis. We can see the difficulty this creates if Homer, elevated to the great authority on the gods, presents them as rivals and introduces discord. Plato is explicit on this in his Timaeus Critias dialogues. These are set very deliberately on the great Panathenaea, the festival introduced by Pisistratus. In these dialogues, through various modes, Plato insists on one point: the gods do not quarrel. Nor is it an accident that he has Socrates expel Homer from the Republic on this point. Homer sowed discord among the gods. Scholars are prone to extraordinary contortions to explain Plato's hostility to Homer. The gods do not quarrel, I want to say, is the voice of the Acropolis. Moreover, the entire fabulous construction of the story of Atlantis takes this form in Plato. It is the material of an epic poem that would have been superior to Homer, we are told, if only Solon had found the time to write it. The great feature of the Solonic epic, though, is that the gods do not quarrel. Athens and Atlantis fight, but not Athena and Poseidon. Discord does not extend to Athena and Poseidon, which is to say, there is no duality at that ontological level. Here Plato offers an alternative history. On the Panathenaea, he offers Solon instead of Pisistratus. He offers the Atlanticus instead of the Odyssey. He corrects Pisistratus's error. In the same work, Plato also signals another dimension to the secret history of Athens, namely that Athens was not alone in this doctrine. The theology of the Acropolis cultus was not a local oddity. In fact, in large measure, it had been imported. There were countercurrents in the time of Pisistratus, but these are almost entirely hidden from us. King Amasis of Egypt, referenced by Plato several times, was a contemporary of Pisistratus. He ruled from the city of Sais in the Nile Delta. This was a sister city of Athens, and the goddess of Sais, Neith, was identified with Athena. Plato tells how Solon, in the generation earlier, went to visit the Egyptian priests, who told him famously, "You Greeks are just children." In the secret history of Athens, there is a transfer of knowledge, doctrine, cultus from the older civilization to the younger. I will give but one example. On the Acropolis, Athena kept a sacred serpent. This serpent theme in the Athena cultus is not from Athens, it is from the Nile Delta. Aspects of the Neith cultus in Egypt have been transferred to the Athena cultus on the Acropolis. The Acropolis, that is to say, is part of a wider tradition, with roots extending elsewhere. The established cultus of the Kekropia was informed from before the time of Pisistratus, from the time of Solon at least, by links to consonant religious bodies in Egypt. The local religion of Athena, Poseidon and the others that formed in Attica was enriched and fortified, deepened by sister cults in Egypt. This process left no records, only changes on the ground and signs of assimilation. Pisistratus's intrusion of Homer was disruptive and random and counter to that venerable Egyptian heritage. Plato offers King Amasis as a counter-figure to Pisistratus. The introduction of Homer upsets a very ancient body of knowledge. These matters concerned profound things. We might think that a one and many paradox dressed up as Olympian gods is a minor concern, but I want to compare it to, say, the gravity Christians attached to the Trinity. It is a matter of profound metaphysical consequences. Religious systems mature and develop and take in new elements, assimilating compatible material in specific ways. It was the introduction of Homer that imposed an errant theology that could not be accommodated in the ordinary ways with the existing ideology. The philosophers and the playwrights and the historians only hint at this underlying problem, or else are manifestations and symptoms of it themselves. They are restrained in part by Homer's reputation and deep influence, and increasingly by the cosmopolitan setting created by Athenian prosperity and Pan-Hellenic centrality. The prosperity of the city itself, of course, is the result of the unity, not the rivalry of Athena and Poseidon. That is the symbolism of the Panathenaic ship, the central cult object of the festival of the goddess. The peplos of Athena is cast as the sail of the ship. The wind and the sea, Athena and Poseidon, work in unison to make Athens mistress of the seas and of mercantile trading. The Platonic enterprise is best understood as a rectification. It seeks to resolve a deep impasse of many generations standing. It was a long time coming. Plato tries to restore in philosophical mode, in writing, what was implicit or oral in the cultic order. He is guarded about this, using especially the shield of irony and distancing himself from the speakers in his dialogues. His own teacher was put to death after all. But his agenda in this regard is plain enough. It is a very Athenian agenda. In short, his theory of forms, which he never quite defines, is to be understood as an exposure of the doctrines formally bound into the mythos of Athena and Poseidon, the relation of being and becoming. I'll say that again. His theory of forms is to be understood as an exposure of doctrines formally bound into the mythos of Athena and Poseidon, the relation of being and becoming, the one and the many. Plato, in that sense, gives us the secret teachings of the Acropolis. Secret because they were not previously in logical, reasoned, or written form. This exposure is itself a movement of intellectual gravity from an oral to a written mode, and from a sacred to a secular context, as we would call it. It was no doubt a long process, and met natural resistance from an inherently conservative tradition. Socrates never chose to be initiated, or rather we should say, Socrates never chose to take the vow of silence that was incumbent upon initiates. He was not initiated because it would prevent him from talking about certain things. What he talks about, over and over, we call the theory of forms. This is only to say that Plato was a pious, noble-born, patriotic Athenian, a servant or even an agent of the Athenian tradition. There is much that is encoded in Plato. When he talks about Solon, for instance, he's very likely referring to himself. His demiurge is Hephaestus. His four elements are the four gods of the Acropolis. His receptacle of becoming is Gaia. His ideal state in the Republic is a pious vision of an ideal Athenian polis. His philosophy encodes a type of philosophical autochthony, otherwise known as Sophia, always under the gaze of Athena herself and the other divine powers that reside with her on the Acropolis, guiding and protecting the city. To situate it in its proper context, we must recognize the mythological roots of Plato and understand that he is transposing, as it were, the mythos of the Acropolis, or the Kekropia, into a current medium, and also understand what provoked this. Plato is very sensitive to the fact that he is committing it to writing, and very conscious of the powers and distortions of that medium. We should understand his recounting of the myth of Thoth, the Egyptian god of writing, where he notes the disruptive power of writing in this light. It alludes back to the Pisistratean recension and the committing of Homer to writing, and invokes the authority of the Egyptians on the matter. We have very mistaken ideas of Plato's academy. It was in fact a licensed theasos, a cult organization within the state religion, not a freestanding institution of independent inquiry, as we might imagine. But Plato was at the end of a tradition. We think of him as the beginning. In fact, the academy in its subsequent history had little to do with any of this. That is, Plato completed this transposition, and in later times the fact that it was a transposition was forgotten. Our history is not written like that, though. Amnesia set in quite rapidly. It is quite remarkable that reports of Plato's followers show little insight into the mythological background of his doctrines. They have become merely philosophy, detached from their original source. The nexus with the Acropolis was lost. The nexus with the Acropolis was lost all the way down to its Egyptian roots, although these were revived much later by the Neoplatonic tradition. It is said that Plato lived into his 80s. Our history never underlines the fact that Athens, by this time, was in rapid decline. Our admiration for the academy, which is probably misplaced, gives us a false impression of continuity. By the time of Plato's death, Athens had passed her zenith as a cultural centre and was already being dominated by Macedon. The local cosmos was already violated. This was later allegorized in Roman sources by making a certain Macedonian Aristotle arrive in Athens to become Plato's champion pupil. This is another chapter in the secret history of Athens. But beyond Plato, everything goes through the filter of the Romans. Nearly everything we know about the academy and the movement of ideas after Plato comes to us through Roman sources. The important thing to know about the history of Athens in that case is that the army of Sulla, the Roman general, not so much looted the city as relocated it to Athens, where it was retrospectively reinvented back to Plato's time. And before that, the great watershed of Alexander the Great intervened. the Gordian knot. The period of Alexander was not about consolidation or restoration or reformulation or translation or transposition, but rather distribution. In the secret history, Alexander takes up the mantle of the philosopher king. He was still a toddler when Plato was an old man. That's why Aristotle was necessary. That can be a topic for another time.